recognize members that we have here tonight, and may we be edified by our study together. We're thankful for this opportunity. It's in Jesus' name. Some of the prophets. We looked at the nation of Israel leaving Egypt, wandering the wilderness, entering the promised land, going into captivity, and returning and rebuilding. We looked at the rulers in the first century. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had been called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Further down in verse 32 it reads, "And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might attain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain by the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us." One of the things I point out to the high school class all the time is sometimes chapter breaks don't do the Bible justice. Those are put in there by someone later on. Because chapter 12 is a continuation of chapter 11. If you keep reading, starting in verse 1, "Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Throughout the Bible, throughout the Old Testament, there is one goal: bringing Jesus. Bringing Jesus here so that we can have salvation. A lot of those names that we looked at through the Old Testament were part of a family. Not just the family of God, but more specifically, they were descendants of Abraham. Abraham was given a promise, and it was passed down. That brings us to Christ coming. Christ came, Christ lived, Christ was betrayed, he was crucified, but death couldn't hold him. Hades had no power over him. He rose again on that third day and gave us an opportunity to be with him and his Father in heaven. You look through the Bible, and all these characters, all these people, their stories point to God. It may be the case tonight that, well, you don't know God. But we can look through the Bible. We can study and see what he's done, see what he's promised. That salvation that he's promised, that hope of heaven, is only found in his body. You only get into his body by being baptized. So maybe the case that you don't know, but we can study with you. Maybe it's the case that you have studied, you have sat there, you've read the scriptures, you've talked to people, you've come to the conclusion, I'm not saved. My destination is not heaven, and I need to make that right. You have that opportunity. Maybe you've been baptized. Maybe you've let the world get you down, and you've been distracted from what the promise is. One of the things we've been talking about Paul and some of his close companions over the last couple of weeks is Paul spent a lot of time in prison. Paul spent a lot of time separated from those that he wants to work with, separated from the ability to go and travel and be with these congregations. It may be the case that you've lost sight on God. You have that opportunity also. You can come forward, you can ask for forgiveness. One of our elders will pray for you. We will do whatever it takes to get you back on track. If you have that need or any of these needs, you can come as we stand and as we sing.
Good to see everyone with us tonight. We are thankful that you have joined us this evening. I know we've got some visiting. They're probably in from out of town with family and things like that. We appreciate you being here as well. We'd love to have a record of your attendance. There is a card in the pew in front of you that's got a QR code on it. You can use your phone, or if have that to do, one of the members here could do it with their phone, and you could give us your information. We'd love to have a record of your attendance so we can reach out and thank you for being here. Just a couple of announcements we want to share with you. We had prayer requests specifically from the Shavers. They are traveling to the Bahama Islands this week for return after Thanksgiving. We wanted to pray on their behalf. I know we've got many others, though, that are traveling as well with the holiday. So please remember all those that are traveling, that they will make it back safely to us. Also remember Ray Strickland. I saw him tonight and asked him, and he is doing better. Had a back strain, but is improving. So we're glad to see him back out, but continue to remember him. Also, we're wrapping up the month, but we've been working on a month of appreciation. So continue to remember our memory verse, Psalm 100, verse 4, which reads, "Enter into his gates with thanksgiving and into his courts with praise. Be thankful to him and bless his name." So continue to remember appreciation. Of course, we've got a holiday relating to that tomorrow, but spend some time thinking about God and appreciation for God through the rest of this week. On Sunday, though, we will be having our internal seminar, and so we will have a combined adult class here in the auditorium. So everybody will be here for Bible class. We'll give you some updates on things from this year and going into 2025 and the plans for that. And then at 1:30, we'll have an update regarding our building fund and building update and some actual plans that you'll see. So that'll be what will happen in our 1:30 afternoon session. Gather together for that. Next Wednesday, we'll begin our new quarter. So we will still have the same 3 classes that we've been offering. The Mark class, though, will be moving into the auditorium. So that will be the one that now will be streamed for the next couple of months. So Mark will be moving in here, and then Ezra and Nehemiah will be repeated in the back, and then the personal evangelism class will be back there as well again. On Sunday, also, the sisters praying without ceasing will meet at 1 p.m. We will have pew packers at 1:15, and then the Tom's classes at 1:30 for our young people as well. That is all the announcements I think I have at this time. So we look forward to having closing song and prayer, and then having our final class for the quarter of the classes we're working on now.
Please stand with me and let us sing hymn number 160. 160, sing the first and last verse. And then Jaden Jackson will have our closing prayer. Down at the cross when my Savior died, down where from cleansing from sin I cried, then to my heart was a flood. We're singing glory to his name.
We come before you tonight, thankful for you and thankful for your glorious name. We thank you for waking us up to see this morning and be able to do all that we have done this morning. We thank you for allowing us to be able to hear your traveling to other folks' houses for Thanksgiving, Lord willing, tomorrow. We ask that you keep us safe spiritually as well as we fight the devil every day. Please help us to be able to be mindful of folks who may not be doing too well spiritually, physically, and mentally. Please help us to be able to encourage them as you encourage us. Please forgive us for saying today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem for the first time around 445 BC, and then he returns to Shushan as he promised, 433, and then he goes back to Jerusalem to finish his work. Chapter 1. So there's a report that comes in from Nehemiah in chapter 1. Hanani and men from Judah, which is a province that Jerusalem is in, actually bring him back a report, and he gets quite emotional and upset about the problem. Remember what the problem was? The gates were burned chapter 2. He then shows his feelings to the king. Do you remember why he was close to the king? He is a cupbearer. We learned that at the end of chapter 1, that he has a very prominent position. He is the cupbearer to the king. And so he decides when and where to show the sorrow that he has for Jerusalem, the walls and the gates in front of the king. And then, of course, the king responds by inquiring about why he's feeling so down. And Nehemiah is ready to tell him about the bad conditions in Jerusalem. And then he makes his requests. He asks for permission. He asks for resources. He gets everything he needs to go there. And in chapter 2, we start seeing, as Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem, his enemies, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And at that point, they're just laughing that Nehemiah is not going to be able to get this task that he's so worried about. He's not going to be able to get it done. So they're making fun of him. But he responds in chapter 2 by simply saying, you guys have nothing to do with this. You don't have any investment, ownership, heritage, nothing in Jerusalem. So get lost. Chapter 3 is basically one of the things that we see over and over again is, especially when it pertains to the worship, the city of Jerusalem, the things that have to do with God and the things that God has prescribed for them to do, we will see a list of people who are involved. Why is that important? Many hands make light work. And there were many hands. You remember how many people were who went to Jerusalem with Nehemiah? Round numbers, 42,000. Remember how long it took them to get there? Bonus question. About 4 months to go from Shushan Geshem was an Arab. He would have been to the south of Jerusalem. So his enemies, the enemies of the Jews, the people who don't want them to be successful, are surrounding them. And they are doing their best to stop them. So now Tobiah mocks the construction of the wall. He says it's so weak that if a fox jumped on it, it would fall down. All right? And then Nehemiah prays in this particular situation because he's got a lot. You can imagine being in charge of 42,000 people, and those were not all the people in Jerusalem. Those were just the people he brought with him. He's got this monster task of rebuilding this wall, and he's got to keep everything on track so that they can, by the time he leaves, by the time we end this all, that not only is the walls built, the gates are built, the temple is ready, but that the worship, the people have been educated to worship as they should, and that the right people are in charge of the worship, and the whole thing is organized properly in terms of times, in terms of days that they're observing. So he's got to educate them all. And now you have these antagonists in Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem really, throwing wrenches in the machinery of getting all this stuff done. So Tobiah mocks him, and Nehemiah prays. When he prays this time, it's really kind of, I don't know how I'll characterize it, but he didn't like these guys, so he's not praying for good things for them. In fact, he says, don't forget how bad these guys are. This point in chapter 4, they're working on the wall, and the wall is half done. And the more they got done on the wall, the more Sanballat and his guys get upset, and the more they do. First they're laughing, then they're scorning, and now they're ready to fight. In chapter 4, they cook up a conspiracy to come and attack them in an ambush. And so Nehemiah hears about this, prays, and then he organizes. He sets up a watch. He sets up a system so that they'll have weaponry and that they will be on the lookout for anybody who will come to attack them. And then at that point, they have a visual deterrent in that they're working on the wall, but they have swords, and they're ready to fight. So when the surprise attack is supposed to happen, whenever that was, it was probably deterred by their visual arming and their visual readiness for war. And then, towards the end of chapter 4, day and night, they stayed in the temple. You remember some of the characterizations of that? They didn't. They slept in their clothes. They didn't. They were always ready to fight, and they were always ready to work. Very important task they had. Chapter 5. I have explored. It's actually exploited. So now we have another problem. And the problem is that the Jews themselves were exploiting these workers and their families. They're exploiting the workers and their families Nehemiah comes up with a remedy. You remember what the remedy was? Yes. Right. That was it. You can't profit off of your brothers and sisters. You can't enslave their children. You can't charge interest on their property when all they're trying to do is they're just trying to survive as human beings. You guys are exploiting them. So he set up an assembly. He set up an assembly to make this point to some extent, to shame them as well as to make the promise of doing things the way they should in public, in a way they couldn't back off. They had to give their words. They had to swear to do this publicly. So he makes an assembly. Returning the interest that they had already collected. Good point. Yeah. Give it back. That's right. Good point. That was very important. And in the law, what was wrong with charging interest? Right. Couldn't do it. To other Jews, you couldn't charge interest. It was illegal as far as the law of Moses was concerned. All right, let's go to chapter 6. Wow, we're making good progress. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem and other enemies hear of the progress of the wall. So the wall is did we end up, okay, we didn't end up with the wall being, not until chapter 7. Sanballat, Tobiah, so they decide, as if, again, Nehemiah doesn't have enough to think about, to come up with another strategy. And so this strategy was that they were going to set up a meeting with Nehemiah. They were going to invite him to a meeting. And he of course, said no. He wasn't coming down to meet with them. They did that 5 times. He refused all 5 times. So Sanballat comes up with another strategy, which is to basically indict Nehemiah and the Jews of trying to set up their own kingdom, and that they were going to report them to the king for trying to set up their own kingdom. And basically he told Sanballat that he was lying. He came up with this out of his own head. So then Shemaiah, who was also a friend of Tobiah, comes up with this idea that, and he goes to Nehemiah and asks him to, or tells him that the best thing for him to do is seek refuge inside of the temple to keep safe. What was wrong with that? He couldn't do that. It would have been a sin. Because although he's the governor of this place, he was not of the right tribe, right lineage to be like that. So, and then he learns that this whole thing was set up by Tobiah anyway. So he prays again against his enemy. Into chapter 6, the wall is completed, total of 52 days. And Tobiah allies among the Jews report, allies yeah, intermarriage was a big problem, and then not having the worship. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There are definite parallels there. If I did get those numbers crossed up, I apologize. But the yeah, but the parallels are real. I've said this over and over again in the class that we are looking at human issues when we look at what's going on in the Old Testament. We can learn from those. Perverting the worship, not working together to extend the borders of the kingdom, stagnating those are all bad things for the church. And so one of the things that we can learn from Nehemiah as well is, man, his leadership was unbelievable. His courage, his care, his thoughtfulness. He got emotional about the fact that the things that should have happened to secure Jerusalem weren't happening. And then he moved there himself, left his job, and just went to Jerusalem to lead the group and brought a bunch of folks with him to lead the group to make all this stuff happen. And then when he ran into problems, he handled them. Whether they were coming from the enemies of Israel, or whether they were coming from Israelis themselves. And he was handling them in real time. You know, he had to make decisions right there. He's working on the wall, and he gets an invitation to go to a meeting. He had to think that thing through and come up with a solution right then and there, and realize that it was a trap. And all of those things that were happening with the ambush that Tobiah and Sanballat had planned, he had to figure out, well, how am I going to continue to have the wall be built and be ready for these guys in case they want to throw down? So, very, very, very serious parallels for us as human beings and God's people. He also enumerated all the people who moved into the city. They began the treasury there. Chapter 8, the people come together, and Ezra reads from the law of Moses. Now, chapter 8, up until chapter 8, Nehemiah is speaking in the first person. He says, I did this and I did that, and they came against us, and they asked me to do this. Starting in chapter 8, it's a description of what was happening from the third person. So he's talking about, he's not speaking as, in terms of what happened to him, but he's speaking as to what everybody else is doing, and including himself, the third person. People come together. Ezra reads the law of Moses. Very pivotal moment in the book, because you can imagine how long was it from the beginning of captivity to the end of captivity? You remember? 70 years. So, what was 70 years ago? I'm not 70. I'm 60. So, let's say 1980. Chapter 9. The Jews come together in mourning and contrition for their sins and the sins of their fathers. In chapter 9, we see an entire chronology, not an entire chronology, but a chronology from Abraham all the way to captivity. They're saying, well, you know, you promised Abraham, and you gave him you gave him the name Abraham, and you know, they were in bondage in Egypt, and you got them out, and you know, you led them across the Red Sea, and the armies drowned that of Egypt, and he goes through it all the way up to them going into captivity and now coming out. So that's most of chapter 9, the telling of that story. And at the end of the chapter, the people pledge to be faithful to the law that they're just learning, that they're just beginning to understand. Chapter 10, an enumeration of the people who made the covenant. So the covenant was to be faithful to God's law, and it lists all their names and parts of their lineage. The people of Israel separated themselves from the people of the land. They enter an oath to walk in God's law. And then they agree not to do the things they shouldn't do on the Sabbath, which is work, purchase stuff, and all that. They agree to pay their tithes. And then, you know, along with the worship, there's a bunch of other stuff that they got to do. They got to pay tithes to the Levites in the temple, and the Levites have to pay tithes to the priests, and they all agree to do their part. Chapter 11, they cast lots to select those who are going to live in Jerusalem. And then they actually talk about people who live in the cities around Jerusalem. Chapter 12, the priests and the Levites who return to Jerusalem, they enumerate them by name, again, to certify that these are the right people. They are the right lineage. They are the right tribe. They are the people who have authorization from God to be in those positions. And then they dedicated the wall. They had a great celebration, singing and playing of music and so on and so forth. And then they made sacrifices. Finally, chapter 13. A minute and a half to go. No, just a minute. They read the law and discovered again that the Ammonites and the Moabites couldn't enter the congregation of God. So he's got a number of problems within his people in chapter 13. Elishib, who is a priest, was found to be allied with Tobiah, enemy. Tobiah and his possessions were in the temple, and Nehemiah had them all removed. Then he had the room that they were in cleansed, and then he moved the actual tithes into that room, which is what it was built for. And then he set treasurers up, priests and scribes up within the temple. And then he solved the problem with trading